At 90 years old, I wasn't the kind of man to be fooled easily. Decades in business had sharpened my instincts, taught me to see through lies and manipulation. My wealth, my empire, everything I'd built, was a testament to my ability to control the uncontrollable. But lately, something in my wife Amanda's behavior had shifted. Amanda, 50 years old, had always been vibrant, full of life, and perhaps that's what initially drew me to her. I offered her stability, wealth, and a life many could only dream of. Yet, there she was, disappearing at odd hours, returning home smelling of perfume I hadn't bought her, wearing clothes far too extravagant for brunch with friends. I didn't ignore the signs. Ignorance is the tool of the weak, and I refused to be weak. That evening, when she claimed she was heading out for a charity event, I pretended to believe her. Instead, I followed. Parking a few streets away from the venue, I watched from a distance as Amanda stepped out of her car, not in a gown suited for charity, but in a figure-hugging dress that screamed seduction. She met him, a younger man, mid-30s, with the air of someone who thought he had the world at his feet. They didn't notice me. People like him never see the storm coming. I recorded everything. A subtle tap on my dashboard camera captured their smiles, their touches, and the way she leaned into him as they entered a boutique hotel. I didn't feel anger, it was beneath me. What I felt was cold, calculated determination. Amanda had crossed a line, and there would be no forgiveness. As I drove away, a single thought occupied my mind: as she's made her choice. Now I'll make mine. The next morning, I reviewed the footage I had recorded the previous night. Amanda's smiles, her lingering touches, the way she leaned into that man, it was all there, clear as day. I wasn't angry. Anger clouds judgment. What I felt was a cold, calculated clarity. Amanda thought she could humiliate me, play me for a fool. That was her first and last mistake. By noon, I had already contacted my legal team. I didn't hire just any attorneys, these were sharks, people who didn't just win cases, they destroyed opponents. Freeze every joint account and lock down the credit cards, I instructed them. I don't want her spending another cent of my money. They didn't ask questions. They knew better. Within hours, Amanda's financial freedom would be gone, leaving her nothing but the allowance I gave her, and that, too, was about to disappear. But that wasn't enough. The man she was with, Mark, her personal trainer, needed to learn a lesson as well. I didn't want a simple confrontation, I wanted to ruin him in ways he couldn't imagine. With one phone call, I hired a private investigator to dig into every corner of his life. I wanted names, addresses, employers, debts, and secrets. Later that evening, Amanda walked into the house like nothing had happened. Her smile was the same fake facade she had been wearing for months. "How was your charity event?" I asked casually, my tone as steady as ever. "It was lovely," she replied, dropping her handbag on the table. "We raised a lot of money for the kids." For the kids. I almost laughed at her audacity. She didn't raise money for anything except her ego. But I played along, letting her think she still had the upper hand. Amanda spent the evening scrolling through her phone, texting God knows who, while I sat across the room, observing her. She didn't notice. She never paid attention to me anymore, her mistake. By midnight, my private investigator called with the first batch of information. Mark, the young lover, had a history of debt, a record of minor fraud, and a reputation for preying on wealthy women. This wasn't his first affair with a married woman, and judging by his financial troubles, it wouldn't be his last. "Send everything to me," I said. "Every detail. And find out where he's working right now." As I hung up the phone, I stared at Amanda. She was sleeping peacefully, as if she hadn't betrayed the man who gave her everything. I didn't feel pity for her, only contempt. The morning after Amanda's cards stopped working, I waited patiently for the inevitable explosion. She stormed into the dining room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, frustration painted across her face. "Richard, what's going on? None of my cards are working. The bank says everything is frozen." I set down my coffee mug deliberately, taking my time before responding. "That's correct," I said calmly, meeting her gaze with the same unflinching composure I had used to face far more intimidating opponents than her. "You froze the accounts?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Yes," I replied, my tone even. I realized I needed to take better control of our finances. "Considering your spending habits lately, it seemed like the responsible thing to do." She stared at me, dumbfounded, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't decide what to say next. Finally, she managed, "You had no right to do that. I need access to my money." Money," I corrected. My voice carried no anger, only certainty. "And I don't recall approving any of your recent expenditures." Her indignation turned into a mix of panic and rage. I could see her brain working, trying to figure out how much I knew and what to do next. But she didn't realize I already held all the cards. I left her standing there, storming off in frustration, and retreated to my office. My private investigator had sent me a new report early that morning, and the contents were deliciously damning. Mark, her so-called lover, was a man with a messy history. He was drowning in debt, had been accused of fraud by multiple former business partners, and was even living under an alias to dodge creditors. The cherry on top? He was renting his apartment on borrowed money, barely scraping by. I picked up the phone and made a few calls. Within hours, Mark's landlord agreed to terminate his lease early. A man in Mark's financial situation wasn't worth the trouble. I made sure Mark would be informed that he needed to vacate by the end of the week. Amanda, meanwhile, thought she could charm her way out of the situation. That evening, she cooked dinner, a rare occasion in itself. She poured wine, put on a smile, and sat across from me at the dining table, playing the part of the loving wife. "I wanted to apologize," she said sweetly, her tone almost saccharine. "I overreacted earlier. I've just been so stressed lately, and I let it get to me." I nodded, taking a sip of wine. "Stressful, indeed," I agreed, keeping my tone neutral. "But I think we're finally starting to get things under control." Her smile wavered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered. "I'm glad we're on the same page," she said. The next day, the consequences of my actions began to hit home. Mark found himself without a roof over his head, while Amanda's attempts to use another card met with the same result, denied. By noon, she was pacing the house, her frustration evident in every sharp movement. I watched her silently, observing how quickly her facade was unraveling. She didn't realize I was already several steps ahead of her. The texts she sent to Mark were monitored in real time, thanks to software I had installed on her phone. "Baby," she wrote, "we need to figure this out. Richard's becoming impossible." Mark's response was predictable, vague reassurances and promises that they would get through this together. It was almost amusing how little he understood the depth of the storm that was about to engulf him. On Saturday, Amanda hosted a gathering with her friends. They laughed and gossiped over glasses of my champagne, utterly oblivious to what I had planned. I entered the living room, carrying an envelope in my hand. "Good evening, ladies," I said, my voice polite yet firm. "I hope you're enjoying yourselves. Amanda, may I borrow you for a moment?" Amanda's friends fell silent as I handed her the envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it, pulling out the stack of photographs inside. The images showed her and Mark together, at the hotel, in her car, holding hands in a parking lot. "Richard, I can explain," she began, her voice shaking. I raised a hand, cutting her off. "No need. The evidence speaks for itself." Her friends exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and thinly veiled delight at the drama unfolding before them. One by one, they made excuses to leave, sensing the volcanic tension in the room. Once we were alone, Amanda collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. "Richard, please," she begged. "It was a mistake. I don't care about him, I love you." I leaned in close, locking eyes with her. "Love doesn't betray, Amanda. Pack your things. You leaving tonight." Amanda didn't leave without a fight. Her cries echoed through the house as she frantically stuffed her belongings into designer suitcases. "Richard, you can't do this to me," she shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of desperation. I stood at the base of the stairs, watching with an expression as unmoving as stone. "You made your choice, Amanda," I said evenly. "This is the result." She hurled every excuse she could muster. "It didn't mean anything, I was confused, we can fix this." It was pathetic. Each word fell on deaf ears. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "I need you." "No, Amanda," I replied, my tone icy. "You needed me when you wanted stability. You needed me when you wanted security. But you wanted him when you wanted chaos. So go to him." With that, I turned and walked away. By the time she pulled out of the driveway, the house was silent once again, except for the faint hum of satisfaction in my chest. Mark was next. Amanda might have been the one to betray me, but Mark, the opportunistic leech, enabled her every step of the way. I wasn't about to let him walk away unscathed. The file my investigator handed me was damning. Mark was a man who thrived on manipulation. He'd built a history of preying on women like Amanda, wealthy, restless, and naive. His debts were monumental, his business ventures failed, and his personal life riddled with skeletons. I made a series of calls. First, to Mark's landlord, who was more than happy to evict him once he saw the financial trouble his tenant was hiding. Then, I reached out to several of Mark's former victims, presenting them with the evidence I'd uncovered. A few were hesitant at first, but most jumped at the chance to bring him down. Soon, whispers began to spread. Mark's name surfaced on local forums and social media as a known fraudster. His face appeared in posts accusing him of deceit and theft, each one supported by documents my investigator had unearthed. Meanwhile, Amanda clung to the delusion that Mark was her escape. She sent him messages constantly, desperate to salvage what remained of their plan. "We'll figure this out," one text read. "Richard doesn't control me anymore." I almost laughed. Amanda didn't realize that Mark was already unraveling. By the end of the week, he was evicted, penniless, and living out of his car. He was a sinking ship, and Amanda had tied herself to him without a life raft. But I wasn't done yet. Mark owed money to people who didn't take kindly to delays. With a single phone call, I ensured his creditors knew exactly where to find him. The message was clear: collect what's owed. Amanda's world began to crumble as Mark's life descended into chaos. The man she believed was her savior became her burden. One by one, her texts to me became more frequent and more desperate. "Richard, please talk to me," she begged in one voicemail. "I made a mistake. I don't even care about Mark. I love you." I deleted the message without hesitation. Amanda's tears didn't move me, they never would again. The final blow came when I orchestrated a meeting between Amanda and Mark. They thought they were meeting to plan their next move, but I had other ideas. As they sat together at a cafe, exchanging whispers of false hope, the police arrived. Mark's creditors had pressed charges using the evidence I provided. Officers cuffed him on the spot, his protests drawing the attention of every onlooker. Amanda stood frozen, her face pale as Mark was dragged away. She called after him, but her voice cracked into silence. The cafe erupted into murmurs as she fled, her life reduced to the same rubble as his. I watched from a distance, unnoticed, and for the first time in months, I felt calm. The chaos they'd brought into my life was finally over. Amanda's departure should have brought closure, but for me, it only marked the halfway point. She was out of my home, yes, but the real weight of my anger wasn't just aimed at her. Mark, the parasite who had seen me as a stepping stone, still walked free. That was unacceptable. That morning, as I sipped my coffee and stared out at the sprawling estate I had built, I reminded myself that this wasn't just about revenge. This was about principle. People like Mark didn't just stumble into their behavior, and they thrived on it, preying on those too weak or too trusting to fight back. Amanda may have let him into our lives, but I was the one who would ensure he never did the same to anyone else again. The file my investigator provided painted a damning picture. Mark had a long history of financial misdeeds, failed investments, unpaid loans, and legal disputes. It wasn't difficult to connect the dots. His charm and good looks were tools he wielded to leech off others, and Amanda was just his latest host. I started by contacting Mark's landlord. A few polite words and the right amount of incentive ensured his lease was terminated immediately. Next, I reached out to his former victims, providing them with enough evidence to reopen old cases. Their anger reignited, and within days, Mark found himself swamped with lawsuits, debts, and a mountain of legal troubles he could never hope to overcome. Meanwhile, Amanda's world was shrinking. After her disgraceful exit from our home, she tried to return to the social circles she once commanded. But gossip travels fast, and her name had become a stain no one wanted to associate with. My phone buzzed that evening, a message from an old friend who had seen her at a charity event. She looked lost, the message read. No one would even speak to her. I let out a quiet laugh, not because I found joy in her suffering, but because it proved my point: actions have consequences. Mark wasn't faring any better. By midweek, he had been evicted, and his creditors were circling. He tried to lay low, but I ensured that even his refuge crumbled. One call to a particularly aggressive creditor, coupled with the evidence I had supplied, was all it took to set things in motion. The next day, I received an update from my investigator. Mark had been spotted meeting Amanda at a rundown motel on the edge of town. They were trying to strategize, clinging to the idea that they could somehow rebuild. It was almost pitiful. I didn't wait long to act. Using my contacts, I orchestrated a scenario neither of them could escape. By the time Mark walked out of that motel the following morning, he was greeted by two uniformed officers. Charges of fraud, theft, and unpaid debts had finally caught up to him. The sight of his hands being cuffed and Amanda's horrified face as she watched from the doorway was relayed to me in vivid detail by my investigator. The message was clear, and there was no escape. Amanda, of course, tried to reach out to me again. Her texts had shifted from defiance to desperation, each one more pleading than the last. Richard, I know I made mistakes, one read. But I can't do this without you. Please talk to me. I didn't bother responding. Her apologies were empty, and her love, if it had ever been real, was long gone. The final piece fell into place when I met with the board of the country club Amanda had once frequented. I presented them with undeniable evidence of her financial misdeeds and the way she had used her position to further her affair. By the time I left the meeting, her membership was officially revoked. Amanda showed up at my office the next day, furious. She stormed past my assistant and slammed the door behind her. "How dare you?" she shouted, her face red with anger. I didn't even look up from my desk. "You'll have to be more specific," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You got me kicked out of the club," she yelled. "That was my last connection to anything normal." I leaned back in my chair and finally met her gaze. "Amanda, nothing about your life has been normal since you decided to betray me." Her anger dissolved into tears. "I've lost everything," she whispered. I stood and walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from her. "No, Amanda. You threw everything away. I just made sure you couldn't take me down with you." That evening, I received another update, and Mark's creditors had seized the last of his assets. He was completely bankrupt, with no way to claw his way back. Amanda, now homeless and friendless, was staying in the same rundown motel she once visited Mark at. I poured myself a drink, letting the silence of my estate wash over me. For the first time in months, peace felt like a reality. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been executed to perfection. The destruction of Amanda and Mark's lives should have felt like enough, but it didn't. I had brought them both to their knees, Mark bankrupt and humiliated, Amanda alone and abandoned, but there was a part of me that still burned. Not with anger, but with purpose. Their suffering was temporary. I wanted my lesson to be permanent. I decided it was time to put a definitive end to their games. Mark had always been a parasite, leeching off wealthy women to fuel his life of false luxury. Amanda, on the other hand, had been my wife. That betrayal carried weight, and I wanted her to understand what it truly meant to lose everything. It started with Mark. My investigator found out he was trying to scrape together enough money to leave town, using whatever means he could. Old contacts, shady favors, he was desperate to escape the mess he'd created. I couldn't let that happen. I arranged for his creditors to meet him at his last known location. When he tried to slip away from the motel where he'd been hiding, they were waiting. Mark didn't stand a chance. The scene, as described by my investigator, was poetic, his pleas falling on deaf ears as his remaining possessions were seized on the spot. The man who had strutted through life with fake confidence was left with nothing but the clothes on his back. But the most satisfying part came when I anonymously contacted a few of his former victims. I offered them financial support to pursue criminal charges. Within days, the authorities reopened cases against Mark, ensuring that his time in the shadows was over. Amanda, meanwhile, was spiraling. I received reports of her aimlessly wandering through town, attempting to reconnect with old friends who no longer wanted anything to do with her. She had become a pariah, a walking reminder of what happens when loyalty is traded for indulgence. Despite her desperation, she continued to text me. Every message followed the same pattern, begging for a second chance, swearing that she'd learned her lesson. "Richard, I'll do anything," one text read. "I know I made mistakes, but I'm ready to fix this. Please, just talk to me." I didn't reply. Amanda had already shown me what her promises were worth. Words were easy. Consequences were what mattered. The next phase of my plan was as much about closure as it was about justice. I arranged a meeting with Amanda, not out of pity, but to deliver my final message in person. She arrived at the cafe looking nothing like the woman I had once married. The confidence, the poise, all of it was gone. She sat across from me, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "Richard, I don't know where to start," she stammered. "I know I hurt you. I know I made terrible choices. But I want to make things right." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "And what does making things right look like to you?" I asked, my tone devoid of emotion. Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. I just want a chance to fix this. To fix us." I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "Amanda, there is no us. Not anymore. You shattered that the moment you betrayed me." She reached across the table, her hand hovering over mine. "Please, Richard. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what to do." I pulled my hand back, keeping my gaze steady. "You want to know what to do? Learn from this. Understand that actions have consequences. And remember that the life you threw away was the best you'll ever have." Her tears fell freely now, but they didn't move me. I stood, placing enough cash on the table to cover the bill, and looked down at her one last time. "Goodbye, Amanda." As I walked away, I didn't feel regret. I felt closure. That evening, I received the final report from my investigator. Mark had been arrested, charged with multiple counts of fraud and theft. Amanda, having exhausted every avenue, had checked into a shelter. Her life, once filled with luxury and privilege, had been reduced to survival. I poured myself a drink, watching the sunset over my estate. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. Not because of their suffering, but because I had restored balance to a life they had tried to dismantle. Justice wasn't always kind, but it was always necessary. Amanda and Mark were at their lowest, but that didn't mean they were finished paying the price. I had stripped away their comfort, their dignity, and their illusions of control, yet something inside me told me that they still didn't fully grasp the weight of their betrayal. I wasn't seeking revenge for the sake of revenge. I wanted clarity, an irrefutable ending that neither of them could twist or manipulate into a false narrative. The day of Mark's auction arrived on a crisp, sunny Saturday morning. The event was widely publicized, thanks to the creditors who had worked with me to ensure maximum exposure. Flyers advertising the auction of a fraudster's collection had been plastered around town. The media picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale of greed and deceit. By the time the auctioneer took his place, a crowd of locals had gathered, their curiosity piqued. Mark was there too, though not by choice. He was escorted in handcuffs, his presence required to verify the items being sold. Gone was the man who once strolled into luxury hotels with confidence and charm. His tailored suits had been replaced with a cheap jumpsuit, and his face, once full of smug self-assurance, was now pale and drawn. Through careful planning, I ensured Amanda was close enough to witness it all. She thought she was meeting a friend at a cafe across the street, one of the few people she believed still cared about her. In reality, that meeting was arranged by me. The friend was someone I trusted, someone who had no intention of offering her comfort. Amanda arrived early, wearing a coat that was too large for her slight frame. She looked fragile, almost gaunt, her once polished image now a shadow of its former self. She sat at a table by the window, sipping tea she had likely struggled to afford. Her eyes, distant and tired, wandered toward the commotion outside. It began with smaller items, Mark's watches, his designer shoes, his electronics. The crowd murmured with each announcement, some laughing at the absurdity of it all, others snapping pictures to share on social media. But it was the car that drew the most attention. The sleek luxury sedan, once Mark's pride and joy, was rolled into view. The auctioneer made a show of describing its features, inviting bids with theatrical enthusiasm. The crowd roared with mockery as the bidding began. From her seat in the cafe, Amanda's curiosity turned to unease. She stood, stepping outside to get a better look. The moment she saw Mark, flanked by officers and humiliated before the crowd, her face went pale. She froze on the sidewalk, her hands trembling at her sides. Mark didn't see her. His focus was on the items being paraded in front of him, symbols of the life he had built on lies, now reduced to nothing more than inventory. The crowd jeered, some shouting insults, others filming the spectacle for their own amusement. Amanda didn't move. She didn't try to approach him or call his name. She simply stood there, watching as the man she had thrown everything away for was stripped of the last remnants of his false success. That evening, Amanda called me again. Her voice was almost unrecognizable, weak, trembling, as if each word took effort to say. "Richard," she began, pausing as if searching for the right words. "I don't know why I keep calling. I know you're done with me. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't fix. But I don't know what else to do. I have nothing left." Her words were slow, broken, heavy with despair. For a moment, I let the silence stretch, wondering if I should even respond. "Amanda," I said finally, my tone calm but firm. "Do you remember what I told you the night you left my house?" There was a pause before she answered. "You said, actions have consequences." "Exactly," I replied. "And now you're living with those consequences. You wanted to chase something new, something exciting. You wanted freedom. Well, now you have it. And you're free to deal with everything that comes with it." "Richard, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. I've lost everything. I just want to come home. I took a deep breath, letting her words settle before answering. Home? I said, my tone colder now. Amanda, the home you remember doesn't exist anymore. You destroyed it the moment you decided to betray me. Goodbye. I ended the call before she could respond. By Monday, Mark's legal troubles had reached their peak. The additional charges filed by the district attorney ensured that his sentence would be lengthy, leaving no room for appeals or negotiations. His creditors, relentless in their pursuit, had seized everything he once owned. There was no escape for him now, just a long stretch of time to reflect on the choices that led him there. Amanda, meanwhile, had been forced to leave the shelter. Her last known address was a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where anonymity was both a selling point and a curse. A mutual acquaintance called me that week, mentioning they'd seen her in passing. She looked like she hasn't eaten in days, he said. I almost didn't recognize her. I thanked him for the update, though I felt nothing as he spoke. Amanda and Mark had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. As I sat on my balcony that evening, watching the sunset over my estate, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for months. Justice, I realized, wasn't about vengeance or anger. It was about balance. Amanda and Mark had disrupted my life, and I had restored that balance with precision and purpose. I raised my glass to the horizon, letting the stillness settle around me. For the first time, I felt whole. Amanda and Mark's lives were unraveling faster than they could grasp. By now, they were mere echoes of the people they pretended to be, shattered illusions masquerading as individuals. I had no interest in their redemption or survival. My focus was singular, to ensure they could never rise from the wreckage. Mark had been transferred to a maximum security facility, his once prized confidence stripped away like the cheap suits he'd pretended were tailored. He was no longer the slick talker who'd stolen from me and countless others. Now, he was a number in a system that neither cared for his charm nor his excuses. Amanda, meanwhile, had become a wandering shadow. She had burned through every connection, her phone calls answered only out of obligation or morbid curiosity. Her descent wasn't just a fall from grace, it was a collapse into irrelevance. I first heard of Amanda's latest plight from an unexpected source. A former mutual acquaintance, a woman who had once fawned over Amanda's supposed elegance, called me one morning. I thought you might want to know, she said, her voice tight with poorly concealed schadenfreude. I saw Amanda yesterday. She's staying in some awful motel on the outskirts. She looked, well, let's just say, not herself. Why tell me this? I asked. Curiosity, I suppose, she admitted. And maybe a bit of closure for you. I can't imagine it's easy seeing someone like her fall so far. I thanked her politely, though the call left me with a sour taste. I didn't need closure from Amanda's downfall, I'd orchestrated it. A few days later, my assistant informed me that Amanda was at the gate of the estate. She's been out there for nearly half an hour, she said, her tone neutral. She's asking to see you. Let her wait, I replied, returning to my work. An hour passed before I stepped onto the balcony overlooking the gate. Amanda stood there, soaked from the drizzle that had begun to fall, her coat clinging to her frame. She looked up as soon as she heard the door open, her face pale and streaked with tears. Richard, she called, her voice shaking. Please, I just need to talk to you. I leaned against the railing, saying nothing. Please, she said again, her tone pleading. I don't know what else to do. I've lost everything. You're the only one who can help me. I studied her for a long moment. Help you? I said finally, my voice calm but sharp. Amanda, what exactly do you think I owe you? I don't know, she admitted, her words tumbling out in a rush. But I can't do this on my own. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I can change. I promise I can change. Change, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Do you think that erases what you've done? Do you think it brings back the trust you shattered or the life you destroyed? I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. Sorry? I laughed bitterly. Amanda, sorry is a word. It's empty. It doesn't undo months of lies, months of betrayal. She reached out as if to bridge the distance between us. Please, just give me a chance. I'll do whatever it takes. I stepped back from the railing, shaking my head. You don't get another chance, Amanda. Not from me. Go. Live with what you've done. Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse. Then, slowly, she turned and walked away, her steps heavy and uncertain. I watched her until she disappeared from view. The following week, I received word that Mark's final appeals had been denied. The weight of the charges against him, combined with the lawsuits I had encouraged his creditors to pursue, ensured that his sentence would be severe. He was finished, both in the eyes of the law and the public. Amanda's fate was quieter but no less final. She had pawned her last valuable possession, a bracelet I had given her years ago, to cover the cost of her motel. I arranged for it to be auctioned alongside Mark's belongings, ensuring that even her most sentimental ties to the past were severed. The auction itself was a quiet affair, held in a nondescript courthouse. Amanda stood outside, watching from a distance as the bracelet was sold to a stranger. My investigator described the scene with precision, as she didn't cry, didn't plead. She simply turned and walked away, her head bowed, her figure hunched against the cold. That evening, I stood on the terrace of my estate, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. I poured myself a drink, savoring the stillness. Amanda and Mark had gambled everything on their selfishness, and they had lost. But their defeat wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice. They had dismantled trust, mocked loyalty, and turned betrayal into a weapon. I had simply ensured that the wounds they inflicted on others would never heal for them. As I raised my glass, a sense of clarity washed over me. This was not triumph. It was balance restored. Mark and Amanda believed they had endured the worst. But what they failed to realize was that consequences don't end with acknowledgement, they persist, carving into your life like erosion on stone. My goal wasn't just to see them fall. It was to ensure they stayed down, haunted by the choices that led them there. Mark's situation was irreparable. Every attempt to escape accountability had failed. He was now locked away, facing years of confinement with no hope of appeal. But my interest in him wasn't limited to his imprisonment. I wanted to ensure the full weight of his actions reverberated far beyond those prison walls. My investigator provided a list of Mark's former victims, people he had defrauded, manipulated, and abandoned long before he crossed paths with Amanda. They had stories, small business owners he'd cheated out of payments, women he'd conned into funding his failed ventures, even a childhood friend he had betrayed for a quick profit. I contacted each of them anonymously, offering the resources and evidence they needed to take action. Some pursued legal avenues, the others simply wanted closure. One woman, a single mother who had lost her savings to one of Mark's schemes, told me, "I don't care about the money anymore. I just want him to know what he did to me." I made sure she got her chance. Amanda, meanwhile, was sinking deeper into obscurity. The once polished woman who had commanded rooms with her charm was now a ghost of herself. She had stopped calling me, though her desperation still lingered in the occasional voicemail I hadn't bothered to delete. "Richard," one message began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if you even listen to these, but I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, just tell me what to do." But Amanda's apologies weren't about remorse, they were about survival. She wasn't sorry for betraying me, she was sorry for the consequences. My legal team had been quietly working to finalize the next step. During her affair with Mark, Amanda had accrued tens of thousands of dollars in charges to my accounts. Hotels, expensive dinners, gifts, all paid for with money she hadn't earned. It was time for her to face that debt. When the lawsuit was filed, it was delivered to her personally at the motel where she was staying. The process server later described her reaction, as she had stared at the papers for several minutes, her expression blank, before whispering, "I can't pay this." The lawsuit wasn't about the money. I didn't need it. It was about making sure Amanda couldn't outrun her choices, no matter how far she tried to flee. The day of the court hearing arrived. Amanda had chosen to represent herself, likely because she couldn't afford an attorney. She stood before the judge, visibly nervous, her words fumbling as she tried to argue her case. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said at one point, her voice trembling. "I was confused. I made mistakes, but this feels excessive." The judge wasn't swayed. The evidence was overwhelming: receipts, timelines, and even text messages between her and Mark discussing how they had planned to spend my money. The verdict was swift and decisive. Amanda was ordered to repay every cent. When the ruling was read, she didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply stood there, staring at the floor, as if the weight of the moment had finally crushed her. I watched from the back of the courtroom, unseen. As I left, I glanced at her one last time. For a brief moment, our eyes met. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but I turned and walked away before she could. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my estate, the cool night air brushing against my face. The horizon was painted with the deep reds and purples of a fading sunset. In my hand was a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the last light of the day. Amanda had gambled everything on her betrayal and lost. Mark had thought he could outsmart everyone and paid the price. Together, they had tried to dismantle the life I built, but in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. Justice isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes, it's quiet, a steady force that works in the background, erasing the damage piece by piece. As I sipped my drink, I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. Only peace. The storm they brought into my life had passed, leaving me standing stronger than before. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to smile. The storm had come in waves all evening. From the warmth of my study, I watched the rain strike the windows in jagged lines, blurring the outlines of the world outside. It felt fitting, this chaos reflected what I had endured and survived. Tonight wasn't about celebrating or lamenting. It was simply about letting go. Mark's collapse was absolute. His name had become synonymous with failure and deceit. The ripple effects of his manipulations reached farther than I had anticipated. The creditors I had helped mobilize weren't content with just repossessions and lawsuits. They dug deeper, uncovering other debts, unfulfilled contracts, and broken promises. What struck me most was the silence that followed. For someone who thrived on noise, attention, schemes, the hum of activity, Mark had been reduced to nothingness. The prison walls offered him no audience, no allies, and no escape. His charisma, once his most potent weapon, was useless in a place where survival depended on trust and respect, two currencies he didn't possess. I had ensured that even the smallest remnants of his former life were stripped away. Mark wasn't just gone, he was erased. Amanda's story unfolded differently. She hadn't fought the lawsuit after the ruling came down. Instead, she let it swallow her whole. Her debts were insurmountable, her reputation beyond repair. Yet, unlike Mark, she wasn't confined by physical walls. Her prison was internal, a weight she carried wherever she went. I had learned she spent her last days in town wandering the park near her motel. My investigator told me about her routine, as sitting under an old oak tree, staring at nothing, as though waiting for the world to right itself. When I decided to see her one final time, I told no one. This wasn't about confrontation or pity. It was about understanding, about seeing for myself what had become of the person who had once been my partner. The park was nearly empty that afternoon, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Amanda was exactly where I expected her to be, sitting on the weathered bench beneath the oak, her shoulders hunched, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't notice me at first, not until my footsteps crunched on the damp gravel path. When she looked up, there was no surprise in her eyes. Just a quiet resignation. "Richard," she said softly, her voice frayed at the edges. I nodded. "Amanda." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than anything I could have said. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just tired. "I wanted to see you," I replied. "To understand." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Understand what? How far I've fallen? How much I've lost?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I studied her closely. Her once pristine appearance was gone. Her clothes were loose, worn, her hair pulled back haphazardly. This wasn't the Amanda I had married. That woman had been polished, deliberate, full of fire. The person before me was a shadow of her former self. "Do you regret it?" I asked, breaking the silence. Her gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers twisting together. "Every day," she whispered. "But regret doesn't change anything, does it?" "No," I said quietly. "It doesn't." She looked back up at me, her expression almost pleading. "Is there any way forward? Anything left? For us?" "No," I said firmly. "Not anymore." She nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted. "Maybe you can't," I replied. "Some things aren't meant to be fixed." Her breath hitched, but she didn't cry. Instead, she straightened her back, as though bracing herself against the weight of my words. "I suppose this is goodbye, then," she said. I nodded again. "Goodbye, Amanda." I turned and walked away, my footsteps fading against the damp ground. I didn't look back. That night, the storm reached its peak. I stood on the balcony of my estate, the rain pounding against the stone railings, the wind howling through the trees. Lightning lit up the horizon, casting brief, sharp shadows across the land. Amanda and Mark had gambled everything and lost. Their choices had destroyed them, but the destruction wasn't my victory, it was theirs to own. Justice isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes, it's quiet. Methodical. Absolute. As I raised my glass to the storm, I felt the weight of their betrayal lift from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely. The chaos was over. The past was behind me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think about the future, not with bitterness, but with hope.